So my kids go to a very small school in a tight-knit community. And in this video, I want to explain to you why I made that decision for my family. Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Cynthia Veronica and welcome to another story time. If we are meeting for the first time, I have two children, Samantha, who is 3 years old, Sebastian, 5 years old, and Sebastian just happens to have achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism. So right now, pandemic considerations aside, we're kind of at a crossroads when it comes to making a decision about schools. So when it comes to schools, there's so many considerations, and it's not just private school versus public school. It's not that simple anymore. There are religious private schools, traditional public schools, charter schools, independent schools, magnet schools, online schools, and the list goes on. And not to mention, public schools are required to adhere to certain laws when it comes to disabilities, and private schools aren't necessarily required to adhere to these same laws. So the choices are just overwhelming. So I made the decision to keep my kids in a relatively small school, and here's the reason why. So first, let me explain to you that when Sebastian was first born, we were living in San Francisco. So it was very typical for young couples to take their babies to things like story time at the bookstore, going to the library, to baby music class, to the park. We would take them out on the stroller and go on strolls in Noe Valley. We would go to the farmer's market, we'd go to coffee shops, we would go to outdoor dining spaces. So in some of these locations, we would encounter the same people, but for the most part, we were encountering new people on a very frequent, probably daily basis. When you're in a really big city, you just encounter new people all the time. And what I started to realize is that when you have a child with a visible difference, it's almost like having a baby celebrity. And sometimes the encounters were really good, but not all the time. And the kind of crazy thing for me was that it wasn't always just children that were noticing Sebastian. It was also adults. It was actually primarily adults that would notice him, and they would, stare or even point, or sometimes they would even laugh. Adults. That's what was so crazy to me. And there's so many examples that I could talk about. And I'm just gonna pick one. I recall one particular instance when I took Sebastian to an indoor play space in San Francisco. And I think Sebastian was probably around 3 years old at the time. So around that time, Sebastian was going to speech therapy on a frequent basis. And this speech therapy location just happened to be around the corner from this play space. So it kind of just became a habit for us to go first to speech therapy, and then right afterwards we would walk over to this indoor play space. So on one particular day, we decided to go to this play space. And there were always nannies at this play space. And you can kind of tell which ones were the nannies versus which ones were the actual mothers or relatives of the kids. And there was this one particular woman, and I can kind of tell she was the nanny and not necessarily the mother of the child that she was taken care of. You could always tell which ones were the nannies because the nannies would constantly be just on their phone or disinterested in the child, even if they were crying, or somehow you could just tell it was just a job for them. So anyway, there was this one woman, and I remember she was Filipino. And I say this because the child that she was in charge of was blonde, blue-eyed, just very Caucasian. You could tell it wasn't mixed. So you could tell she was the nanny. And also by her mannerisms, you can kind of tell she was a nanny. Her interactions with the child, you can also tell from that too. And she just kept staring at Sebastian. And he was just playing nearby with his trains, sort of just minding his own business and just enjoying himself. And I think he was just completely oblivious, or seemingly oblivious, to the woman that was staring at him. I was just sort of minding my own business too, just watching him, but in the corner of my eye, I could also tell that she was just staring, and she wouldn't stop, and she just kept on staring at him. And so after a while, she finally got the courage to ask me, how old is he? And the thing is, okay, she didn't start with hi She didn't greet us. She didn't try to have a conversation with me and try to kind of just ease it in. It just was like a blatant, how old is he? And the thing is, her question didn't really surprise me. I was used to that question by then. I've had so many people up until that point pretty much come up to me and want to know, how old is Sebastian? I mean, I had complete strangers asking me at the park how old he was. But the sort of difference was not everyone was always that blatant. I mean, they would kind of just ask other questions too and then kind of lead up to it. But you knew, that that's really what they wanted to know. But she just blatantly wanted to know how old he was. So I told her he's 3 years old. And her reaction just really irritated me. She basically just went, "What? He's 3 years old? What?" And it just, I just got so annoyed. You know what? You've been staring at my child this whole time, which is rude. You don't even try to greet us and say hi. You just blatantly ask this question. You're so brazen about it. And then when I tell you, you react like the sky is falling. And this is all in front of my son. And you know what? He can see you, he can hear you, by the way. He is a person. I mean, but luckily he seemed to be a little bit more interested in his toys than in her, so I don't know if he really noticed it or not. And so I ended up just kind of giving her a dirty look and walking away. But honestly, looking back, I actually regret this, especially knowing what I know now. I do think that I could have had a little bit more patience and understanding towards her and her experience. I'm not condoning her reaction, but I think I could have had a little bit more compassion in my response. And here's my sort of takeaway from this whole experience. I realized that when you don't expose people to differences, they see this difference as something that's very unusual. So they tend to stare, and sometimes they don't even realize that they're staring. People generally also don't necessarily know how to approach a situation or how to ask a question. And I've had people who are not so brazen kind of sort of try to tiptoe around their questions. And you could tell that they're trying not to offend you, but they're still very curious. And that's okay. So what I've learned in these past 5 years of having wonderful Sebastian is that it is very important to expose people, especially children, to other people with differences, to educate them. A lot of people don't know about dwarfism or about people with differences. And so it can make everyday life a little bit more disruptive. And so that's what I learned living in San Francisco and being around new people on a daily basis and having these different reactions, some good, some bad, some people blatantly asking you questions, some other people kind of tiptoeing around, really wanting to know, but also not wanting to offend. So there were several different lessons for me in this. One is that I just had to learn a lot about dwarfism, and very quickly once my son was born. But not everybody knows about dwarfism, and even I am still learning. So I learned that there are people that are well-meaning, and they just don't want to say the wrong thing. But people don't always know how to react or how to ask a question or convey their curiosity. And I really wish in that moment, in this particular example that I just explained, that I had realized all of this. Because honestly, if I reflect back in that moment, I don't think she was trying to be offensive. I also think that she just didn't know how to best ask her question. And I wish I had just said, yes, yep, he's 3 years old. And you know what? He has achondroplasia, which is dwarfism. And that's why he is a little bit smaller than your average 3-year-old. But you know what? He has a name, and it's Sebastian. And you know what else? He is also very smart, and he can hear and understand everything that we're saying right now. So let me know if you have any more questions, or you know what? Even better, you can ask him. And by the way, what is your child's name, or the child that you're taking care of? What's his name? And how old is he? And does he like trains? And you know what? Maybe he and Sebastian can play together. It's ultimately all about letting people see that having a difference is okay. And having a difference it's not something to be afraid of. And also, it's not something that's inherently bad or sad. It doesn't mean that they can't interact with other children. In fact, the more children are exposed to it, the more they learn about acceptance. The more that they can normalize differences, the better this world will be. Okay, so back to the school thing. So my kids currently go to a small school, and throughout their education, I kind of want them to continue going to a small school, because when everyone knows that you have a visible difference and they understand why and they understand what it is, and to them it's just a normal thing, it's just not that big of a deal. Okay, so we're out of San Francisco. We're still in kind of a large city, but it's a lot smaller. We're actually in a place where a lot of people know Sebastian. Before the pandemic, we could go to places like the park or the library or to the store, and everyone would be like, "Oh, hi, Sebastian." Everyone, for the most part, is very friendly, very nice, very warm, very open. And it's when we go sort of outside of the community that I start to kind of realize, oh, we're living in kind of a little bit of a bubble right now. And I'm not saying that I want to shelter him all his life, but I do want my kids to live their lives and feel as much normalcy as possible. So that's kind of why I chose a smaller community and smaller school. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to encounter mean people or ignorant people along the way. And I'm still planning on teaching my kids life tools so that when they do have these encounters, that they process it in a very positive and empowering way. Because there are some life tools that they can apply and that I have applied, and that I want to share with all of you guys too, along the way with these story times. So let me know what your thoughts are. If you are a parent to a child with differences, do you prefer a small school versus a large school? And why? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.